All right, so yesterday we celebrated Earth Day. Today, we'll discuss what it means to transport water, fuel, and other essential supplies from Earth to space stations and spacecraft in low Earth orbit. Welcome to this latest installment of Space Talk with the UChicago Space Network, a virtual program series where UChicago alumni and friends have the opportunity to hear from Maroons on the frontier of the so-called final frontier. My name is Josh Levitt, a college alumnus currently supporting students, faculty, and alumni in the Physical Sciences Division at the University of Chicago. Moderating our discussion is Jerry McIntyre's booth classmate Gaurav Kumar, Senior Business Development and Integration Manager at BP and board member of the UChicago Space Network. Gaurav, over to you to introduce Jerry and the subject of today's talk.
Thanks, Josh, and welcome everyone to our fourth Space Talk this year. If you remember, if you are a regular listener, for March we had Professor Abigail Weireg, who spoke about neutrinos and astrophysics, and in Feb we had Matt Shai, who spoke about Canopy Aerospace. And as Josh mentioned, today we have got Jerry, who is a VP of Legal at Orbit Fab. He's also a Booth alum, and he's a fellow board member at UChicago Space Network. Jerry and I and the board of UChicago Space Network have been serving you all for over 2 years now, and it has been fantastic to work with Jerry. So Jerry, welcome to the Space Talk, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Perfect. So Jerry, let's get started, and let's start with your professional journey and your academic and professional overview, and talk about some of the decisions you have taken in your professional journey until now, and what got you to space and what got you to legal.
Yeah, sure. So like Gaurav mentioned, VP of Legal at Orbit Fab. We're a satellite refueling startup that's building the in-space propellant supply chain. I'm also VP of Outreach for the UChicago Space Network. I grew up in Colorado and went to Carleton College for undergrad. It's a small liberal arts college in Minnesota. I was a classical languages major, and if you know anything about ancient Greek or Latin, the career options in that field are pretty limited to academia. So I was trying to figure out what else could I do with my career. Both my parents are lawyers, and they said, don't be a lawyer. So naturally, I became a lawyer. Went to Northwestern and then practiced in Denver at Denton's, a large international firm, in their government contracts group. So working in aerospace and defense, representing a variety of different government contractors, from smaller startups all the way to the large prime contractors. After practicing there for a few years, I got to work on a few M&A deals and really enjoyed the process and kind of consensus building of that. And we were really helping out on the government contract side of that, but wanted to kind of work on more of the general corporate. So I ended up at a small boutique firm called Bold Legal in Denver, where I got to work with startups, work on some M&A deals, and really kind of broaden my experience on the legal side. Around that same time, I was starting to feel disillusioned with the law firm life in general. The work-life balance was starting to feel a little bit unsustainable. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to necessarily be outside counsel for the rest of my career. And so I had applied to business school at that time and got into UChicago, really fortunately. When I got to UChicago, I finally took the time to reflect on what did I want to do for the rest of my career, what was going to make me actually happy. Something that I think I hadn't done as much of in the past. It felt like I was on a sort of trajectory of whatever made the most sense at the time versus what is it that I really feel passionately about. And so I started really thinking about that. And space has always been something that's really been interesting to me, a big hobby of mine. And so tried to find a way to be able to work on that. And I really enjoyed working with startups when I was advising them at Bold Legal, and thought really cool to be able to join an early stage company and get experience doing that. And so really just cold emailed my way through a lot of space startups, just try to make as many connections as I could, and found Orbit Fab during the summer of my first year at Chicago Booth, and was able to intern for them that summer. During my second year at Booth, I was also able to participate in the New Venture Challenge, and probably for one of the first times in that program, there was a space startup. And so it was really exciting to be able to co-found a company called Stellatus. So we were building a communications platform for satellite operators. So right now, there's several thousand conjunction alerts that get sent out by Space Force every day about the potential for satellites to collide into each other. And there really had been no way for operators to be able to accurately and quickly communicate with each other to resolve those potential collisions. And so we're building effectively the start of what would be sort of a Slack for space operators. And that was a really cool experience, got a lot of great mentorship and got to meet a lot of people. And then fortunately, in a weird turn of events, we were acquired by Slingshot Aerospace during finals week of my second year. And so that was another kind of whirlwind experience as a first-time entrepreneur. And I've been with Orbit Fab for the past almost 2.5 years now, going on 3 years, I guess, next month, and really enjoying it.
Thanks, Jerry. And do you want to talk a bit about Orbit Fab, its business, and who are the customers, and what is the vision for the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So our tagline is gas stations in space. And so really we envision a bustling in-space economy that will eventually support permanent jobs in space. Spacecraft are still limited by the amount of fuel that they can bring to space to begin with. And that really limits their flexibility and really poses some long-term risks to the space environment. So we're developing a refueling port that we call RAFTY. And so it replaces the fill drain valve that goes on all satellites when they get fueled on the ground for the first time. And there's two main types of propulsion that satellites use. There's electric propulsion, chemical propulsion, and depending on the mission profile, they might use one or a combination of both. And so this fueling port will enable satellites to become refuelable. And then we'll be launching a network of fuel depots and fuel shuttles that can service those satellites in space. So fuel depots we think of as larger, in space terms, kind of dumber vehicles. So they'll have mostly just a lot of fuel on them. They won't be particularly maneuverable. And then a series of fuel shuttles that are smaller, more agile, more capable, have the ability to rendezvous and dock with other satellites in space. And those will act as the go-betweens from the fuel depots to our client spacecraft. And so I joined in 2020 and we were at about 6 people, and I joined as a business development intern and then joined the business development team full time. And now we're a bit over 50 people. We have an office in the UK, and over the past year and a half, as we've grown, the need for in-house legal has definitely grown. And so I've started taking on that work, and now it is my full-time job and more. And I've really been enjoying being able to sort of marry the two things of the business side and the legal side. And so in terms of customers, really right now, our sort of initial beachhead market is thinking about the satellite servicing companies that are out there. So there's probably over 130 satellite servicing companies that we've been tracking, and they do a variety of different mission profiles. So a typical traditional satellite that doesn't have maneuverability might need to go from one orbit to another, or just be maneuvered, or maybe they've run out of fuel and they need to have a jetpack service so that they can have station keeping so they stay in orbit. Or there's a series of companies that are providing basically orbital tugs, so orbital transfer vehicles or OTVs. All of these use cases require a lot of fuel today. And so we really see them as, if we can enable their missions, that will help a lot of the rest of the space industry flourish. And then long-term, we're looking to have every satellite that launches have RAFTY on there so that that refuelability is an option for them.
Thanks, Jerry. That's fascinating. So essentially, increasing the life of the satellites in space, and also reducing the space debris because of increasing the life of the satellites. Can you talk a bit about the fuel? That's hydrazine, right? And how do you take it up there, and a bit more to the extent you can, the engineering and the technology there?
Yeah, so I mean, effectively right now, satellites launch with, depending on the mission profile, up to about 15 years worth of fuel. And that's really envisioning a world where they don't need to do much maneuvering at all. And that paradigm is now shifting. And so we're trying to provide a service that can provide lots of benefits depending on the use case, but really flexibility and optionality are two big ones. And so in the short term, being able to allow some of these customers to extend their missions, to do more of their missions with the same asset. Otherwise, if a life extension vehicle can typically conduct 2 or 3 missions before it runs out of fuel, that company then has to build and launch additional satellites to be able to continue that business. And launch cost is still the largest driver of cost for companies. Even using sort of the cheapest rideshare models, you're still looking at probably $8,000 or more per kilogram to launch anything to space. And so in the short term, that's what we're trying to do. Longer term, we're trying to help these companies think about different ways of building their architecture so that they have refueling in mind from the start. So if you can launch with less fuel, you save on that fuel mass at launch. You could actually use that extra space for additional payloads. And then once you get to orbit, then you can top off effectively and then go conduct your missions. Or if you're a company that doesn't necessarily have 15 years worth of customers lined up, you might bring 5 years of fuel with you. And then during that 5-year mission, you might come up with new customers, at which point you can refuel between missions and you really have that flexibility. And the main concept here is taking sort of these large capital expenditures and shifting them to operational expenses. And so from our perspective, one of the ways that we're trying to make this as efficient as possible is trying to find long-term deals with launch companies. A lot of these launch vehicles have a lot of excess capacity where they might have a primary payload, but they have extra space. And that space typically doesn't get filled, or they fill it with sort of mass models that don't actually have any real benefit. And so we're trying to work out profit share deals where we can say, look, we're not $1 billion asset that has really sensitive communication payloads or things that have lots of sensitivities on launch. We're effectively third-class mail. So if you just throw up a tank, throw in that extra space, get it to space, and then we can share in some of that profit when we sell that fuel. And so those are some of the sort of creative deals we're trying to strike in changing the way that both satellite operators and launch vehicle providers think about this new world where satellites are much more maneuverable. And so in terms of the fuel types, like I mentioned, electric and chemical propulsion. So hydrazine is still really popular on the chemical side of things. The US government still favors that pretty strongly. It's a very effective propellant, very toxic to humans, so lots of challenges with loading it on the ground. And then on the electric side, you have xenon, krypton, argon, some of the noble gases there. And some of the challenges there have been really just with procurement of that. So the supply chain for xenon has been strained with a lot of macro events, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think that created about a 15 to 20% hit to the global supply chain of xenon, spiking those prices by 20x at the time. So still a lot of kind of longer term challenges to think about as we build out this sort of supply chain logistics network of propellant in space.
Thanks, Jerry. Sounds very exciting and challenging. So essentially, Orbit Fab is sitting at the nexus of the fuel suppliers, the satellite companies, and also the government because of the funding requirements. I'm sure that has a lot of contracting, hoops to jump. Can you talk about some of the main challenges which you as a VP of Legal are facing and how you are going about it, and how do you see the contracting landscape evolving going forward?
Yeah, it's a really exciting time. It's a nascent market, and Orbit Fab is developing novel technologies in that nascent market. So really everything I do week to week feels like it hits on, whether it's just the typical chaos of working at a startup, or the how do we figure out how to do this thing that's never really been done in space before type of challenge. Which is really one of the reasons why I joined a company like Orbit Fab, is to be able to sort of dig into those things and help try to eventually become thought leaders in those areas. So when working in space, you almost always have to work with the government in some capacity. And so whether you're actually contracting with the government directly or just trying to operate in space, you're going to have a lot of government on the regulatory side, especially. So, a lot of the things that kind of take up a lot of my time are the regulatory hurdles that are required in order to be able to operate in space. So In order to operate any kind of spacecraft that has any radio frequency transmissions, you're going to have some kind of license from the FCC. If you have any kind of remote sensing technologies, cameras, optics, those types of things, you're going to have a license or some authorization from NOAA. Launch companies and folks dealing in launch have a lot of contact with the FAA. And so all these processes are time consuming, and most of them are not quite built yet for the new space world, where you have a lot more smaller startups. You have a lot of companies that don't have the sort of history and infrastructure that the traditional large contractors might have. And so some of those challenges are ongoing of how do we move these regulatory bodies to be more nimble and agile to move along with us. We also have lots of challenges on the trade compliance side. So export controls. The government has deemed most space activities controlled in some way for exports to foreign persons. And so the two main pieces there are the ITAR, that's the sort of trafficking in organs, and the EAR, which is everything we do fits into one of those two buckets. And at a high level, they typically restrict our ability to export that technology internationally. And that can be as much as sending an email or verbally discussing some of our technology with someone who's not a US person. And so that requires a lot of both upfront planning as well as the ability to be flexible with our international partners and finding the right ways to have those conversations and get the right authorizations to be able to conduct that business. And then finally, on the regulatory side, I'd say the other big piece is CFIUS. And so that really is the committee that deals with foreign investment. And so because of a lot of these sensitive technologies that are export controlled, CFIUS takes a lot of interest in making sure that companies like us take investment from entities that are coming from countries that they consider to be not to be national security threats. And so that list is fairly long and complicated. And so as we go through the process of fundraising, especially in a pretty tricky fundraising environment, you have to be really cautious about who it is you're taking money from, who their owners are, and that part of it's a long process. And then separately, sort of the side of actually engaging with the government directly. So the government has always been really active in space, whether it's through the civil side with NASA or the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense, especially more recently, has taken huge interest in space. Unfortunately, they view it, and other countries have viewed it as a warfighting domain. That's how they describe it. There's lots of threats from China and Russia and other countries that see space as an opportunity to gain that advantage above other countries. And so we've had to respond in that way. And so as a commercial startup, you have a lot of challenges of how do you conduct the commercial activities you really want to conduct while also finding the opportunities to really participate in this new space industry. And a lot of those opportunities do come from the government, including Department of Defense. And so this past fall, we won approximately $20 million in government contracts from Air Force and Space Force to help them think about refueling. So they really have a huge interest in refueling because it allows them a lot more dynamic space operations. And one of the kind of terms they like to use is the ability to maneuver without regret. So just like every other satellite up there, they're limited by the fuel they have. But if they have this ability to refuel, they can effectively act as, they can show up in one place in space, refuel, disappear, end up on the other side in a different orbit. And so we work pretty closely with them to sort of manage that process and develop our technology in a way that serves sort of the dual use of both the commercial activity as well as supporting the US government.
Thanks, Jerry. And I think that contract with DoD you got last year is the first ever refueling contract. Can you talk a bit about the timelines for that transaction?
Yeah, so
how was the process, of contracting on that transaction, with your suppliers, and do you have long-term supply agreements in place already to supply that fuel, and some of the contractual details?
Yeah, so in 2025, we'll be refueling government DoD satellites in space. and that contract is through the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU. And so they almost act as a bit of a broker here between the commercial customers, commercial suppliers, and the government customers that need this refueling. And over the past several years, there's been a huge push within certain parts of the government to really bring in more startups, more small businesses, more typically traditionally commercial companies into the fold and use their services, as opposed to just looking towards the traditional large prime contractors. And through that process, entities like DIU have been really successful because they've done a good job of trying to kind of meet us where we are, as opposed to thinking about the traditional contract structures that really are built for much, much larger established companies that have robust cost accounting standard procedures, or robust supply chain. How do you reimagine the world where you are working with startups, you are working with smaller companies that can move faster, but they may not have necessarily the same support systems that large prime contractors have. And so the contract mechanisms that we're using for these types of contracts with the government have been pretty favorable and flexible, which we found to be really helpful, as opposed to getting hit with these really onerous restrictions. The regulations on the federal government contracting side can get pretty crazy pretty fast, and a lot of small businesses just don't have the capability to meet those requirements. And so it's nice to see that some aspects of the government are starting to rethink how they do contracting with these smaller businesses like us to be able to provide those services. And one of the things I think they've found to be really helpful is that as a smaller company and as a startup, we've been able to be much more responsive towards sort of their requests, their desires, and how they think about some of these issues. And so even conversations about how do we build our RAF defueling port, using a lot of input from industry, from government, making sure that we're building products that actually match with what customers want. And I think that's been a really sort of fresh feeling for a lot of these government contracting entities that aren't necessarily used to that quick turnaround time and feedback loop of getting that input from them and us being able to implement that really quickly and actually meeting their needs at the time in a much shorter time scale than some of these traditional contracting programs that can go on for 7-10 years. And by the time you even get it done, you've sort of already been obsoleted out of that technology and you need to move on to something else.
And you spoke briefly about the fundraising, and there was a news last week, and congratulations on closing your Series A, $28.5 million. I'm sure a lot of legal work must have gone into that as well. To the extent you can you talk about the process, of that fundraising and what kind of legal challenges you touched on, the foreign entities versus U.S. entities and the export control requirements. What were the other challenges which you came across, and how did you resolve them?
We just closed around just under $29 million. Definitely a long process. I would say looking back to last summer, if you've been following the markets, especially in the private equity world, things were getting a little scary for folks. A lot of the premier sort of tier one venture capital firms were putting out blogs and press releases and guides for startups to how to navigate this changing world where money was no longer being thrown at startups pretty freely. And a lot of the advice was go into survival mode. And so we took that advice to some extent. So we started to pull back on some of our spending, some of our hiring, really making sure we were focusing on sort of the core pieces of our business to make sure that we were correctly focused. And then by the time the fall and winter came, things started to feel a little less scary, but a lot of the investors were still feeling a little skittish. And so it just required a lot more kind of high touch situations, a lot more conversations. Diligence felt like it was, at least even at Series A, tended to be a little bit more in depth, and people were just kind of more focused on making sure that there was a path to profitability and to growth in a way that felt sustainable. And so a lot of credit to Daniel Faber, our CEO, of just being a real relentless hustler and just being really persistent in that process, because it's it was a challenging time for all startups, but overall a fairly kind of easy, clean round for us. As we look towards future rounds and think about more strategic investors, some of which might not necessarily be in the US, we're already sort of planning out what does that look like for some of these CFIUS issues and foreign investment challenges that are going to arise. But I think we've learned enough lessons throughout the process to know just you have to start early and really think about them up front. And so, looking forward to that next stage. And of course, last month or a couple months ago, you throw in a bank collapse in the middle of all of that, and that made for a pretty eventful weekend for our management team of trying to navigate the challenges of trying to meet payroll 3 days later with a lot of your money in Silicon Valley Bank. And so, in a kind of perverse way, I found a lot of those activities to be it was enjoyable in the sense that it was nice to see a young startup's management team be able to get thrown into a pretty challenging situation and just being able to work as a team to try to work out and how to get to the point where we can kind of keep ourselves alive. And I thought we handled it really well. So that was really heartening. And but at the same time, I think I've aged a bit. I think I have a lot more gray in my hair just from that weekend alone.
Yeah, it is. It is very challenging with high interest rates, high inflation. As you mentioned, the bank collapsing, and then we just saw Virgin Orbit filing for bankruptcy, and a lot of SPACs which are having a lot of challenges. So raising money in this time successfully is a great achievement, and it talks about the genuineness of the business model and the prospect of growth and returns for the shareholders. And can you can you talk? Let's switch maybe to our conversation on your career and how it has shaped up. You moved from a legal advisor or working for a law firm to going into a corporate, but that also meant moving from a large company to a startup. And you touched upon it briefly in your introduction. Why you went about doing that. Can you talk a bit more about that switch and what were the challenges which you faced in adapting to that environment? Because it looks very different from outside, and grass is always greener on the other side, but generally it's not. There are a lot of brown patches. So can you talk a bit about those challenges and how did you navigate it then?
Absolutely. So I was at Dentons, which was the largest law firm in the world. At the same time, I was in the Denver office, which is a much smaller office. And so had the smaller company feel with all of the resources of the large firm, which is great. Really enjoyed my time there. Felt like it was really valuable to cut my teeth and really get the fundamentals and really understand the level of work and the types of analyses you need to do to be a successful attorney. Everything I'm going to say here, I guess, is speaking from my experience at an early stage startup. So moving in-house can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. If you work in a very large corporation, you might have experiences that mirror your experience at the law firm or vice versa. But going from a traditional law firm experience to a startup of 6 people, trying to kind of see those differences. And so a few things really stick out to me. One is when you're at a company, especially at a startup, the legal advice you're giving is less about giving recommendations that you hand off to somebody to say, go figure out what to do in terms of how does it fit within your business goals. At the startup, you're the person making that call. So especially as a startup lawyer, you're having to do the legal analysis, come to that decision. And then there are other people involved in the decision, but a lot of times they're looking to you to give not just a recommendation, but effectively almost make the decision about what we're supposed to do about that moving forward. And that took a bit of a mental shift going from, here's all this awesome legal analysis I did, Mr. Client, go figure it out, let me know how it goes, to, oh, wow, the decision I'm making here actually has direct impact and pretty immediate impact on what we're going to do next. So that was a big, just kind of psychological shift that I had to make. And tied to that is sort of the speed of decision making. So, law firm, even with your most demanding clients, you can pretty much always say, let me get back to you, I'm going to go do some research. And that's really what they expect from you. If they're coming to you, that means they've probably either don't have the capacity in-house to have the time to think about these issues, or they've already struggled with trying to figure out what to do, and they're looking for external help. In an in-house situation, a lot of times you're getting requests for help that might have been due yesterday in a very meaningful way, or you just don't have the ability to say, let me go do a bunch of digging and spend the next couple of days focused on this thing. And so trusting yourself and trusting that you can provide these initial pieces of advice pretty much on the spot, and then you can follow up with a little bit more of that detail. I think that mirrors sort of the really good law firm partners, I think, can get to that level where they're able to pretty much give that advice nearly on the spot, but transitioning from sort of that mid-level associate position to jumping into leading the legal department at a company, that took a little bit of a jump start of, okay, this is a real thing, and the time is now to make those decisions. And then being a generalist, that's another huge piece of it. You go from a fairly narrow set of expertise in a law firm, especially when I was working at government contracts or working on M&A deals. Your scope of work tends to be fairly limited to certain types of work. Here, every week I'm thrown things that I've never dealt with in meaningful ways, because maybe it's a complete novel thing in space, or maybe I didn't focus so much on employment law when I was working in government contracts, and turns out there's a lot of employment issues that come up when you're working at a startup. And so learning to have that breadth of knowledge and then be able to dig into those things pretty quickly has been pretty critical. And then risk profile, I think just recognizing that startups tend to have a little more ability to accept risk, and understanding that decisions and recommendations you might make at a law firm for a more risk-averse client don't really fly at a startup. It is a little bit of, we don't have the processes and procedures that a large company might have. We don't have really the ability to wait for certain things to happen. And so there's a little bit of that working with your management team to find the right calibration. And for me, a lot of that's just understanding the context of the situation. And so then if I know what it is we're willing to accept, what it is we're trying to achieve, and we recognize, look, this might be a higher risk situation generally, or this program is just inherently more high risk, I can then say, okay, typically I might think of it this way, but for this situation, we're really going to have to move into a riskier territory and just be okay with that, and just make sure everyone's on the same page that we're moving forward in that way. And so I think it's really been great, because it's made me feel like a much more agile, nimble attorney in that process.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, I think, working for a large company, I can see the internal counsels will rely a lot on external counsels, and it's always, this is my advice. It's your choice whether you want to take it or not, and it's all on the business to take the risk or not take the risk. Jerry, so understanding and learning all these different legal issues in a new and evolving industry like space, how do you go about that? Do you have a support network? Who do you reach out to when you have to jointly maybe figure out how to address a particular issue in legal issue in a contract or arrangement?
Knowing what you don't know is super important. I think any lawyer who thinks they know how to do all the areas of law are probably full of BS. As much as they don't want to admit it. It's funny, my wife always, anytime a legal issue comes up in some area of law that I definitely don't practice, like tax law or criminal law, don't you know all the laws? And I think there is that perception that you're supposed to sort of just be able to do all of it. And I think with enough time and research, you can get fairly close in some areas, but using outside help is absolutely critical. So I have a very large, varied network of outside counsel. So as a startup, cost is obviously a huge driver. And so finding firms that can provide services in particular areas of focus that I need assistance in, that are really good at that can provide favorable rates, And so it requires a bit of juggling when you have 6 or 7 different law firms working for you, but it's nice to know that you have someone there when you really are in a tough spot, or you really just don't know where to go next, to have that ability to have that outlet. And so far that's been successful. And then, yeah, I mean, building out sort of the network of other lawyers in the space industry has been really helpful. So, you know, even just in my 2.5 years here, just starting to meet other in-house counsel, or, you know, just building out that network. And the issues, although you might be working with a satellite servicing company or a launch company, a lot of the legal issues tend to start coalescing around similar things in the space industry, a lot of these regulatory hurdles. And so everyone's been really supportive and helpful, and it's been great to be able to bounce ideas off each other just to figure out, how did you go about this thing? Who have you talked to? How do you manage working with this regulator? And there's so many of those little unwritten rules and processes for being successful. How does the FCC really think about licensing? Who are the right key decision makers you want to be able to talk to in order to make sure that they have a heads up about the license you're about to file? And all these little things that can trip you up if you really haven't gotten there before. And so definitely, you know, not being afraid to ask for help has been pretty important towards that success.
Yeah, and Jerry, you know, in the low carbon energy business, I see with all these different requirements which the government is asking the Department of Energy or Department of Transportation is building a lot of these regulations. They seek feedback from the companies. The same with, you know, all the tax credits, for example, which are coming in. The IRS seeks feedback from all the companies. So I believe you all also have a right to provide feedback in shaping all these different regulations and guidelines, right?
Yeah, so you know, the administrative law regime in the US is largely built upon getting requests for comments and responding to those and building those into how they think about their proposed rules when they're trying to establish new areas. And that's particularly true in the space industry. So, for example, in the fall, the FCC put out a notice of inquiry to companies that are in the ISAM industries, that's sort of in space manufacturing type, in servicing type activities. And they basically were saying pretty open-ended, look, we know this industry is really growing. We know a lot of you have lots of great ideas for how the FCC should be managing this process from a license allocation, spectrum allocation perspective. Please help us understand from your perspective, where is the industry now? Where is it going? What help do you need from us in order to get there? And so we were able to respond with a lot of our comments that had a lot of overlap with a lot of our other partners and customers in terms of the things they're looking to do. Right now, as a team of one, I'm sort of running that policy side of things along with some of our engineers who are focused on those particular areas. But there are other companies that have more focus on that policy side. So if you look at like an Astroscale, for example, they do life extension services in GEO, and then they do active debris removal in low Earth orbit. And they have a pretty robust policy team that has a lot of focus on these areas where they have regulatory attorneys, or they have folks that are policy analysts that are thinking about space sustainability. And so they're really being thought leaders in that area of how do you kind of think about this new era, and how do you help bring these regulators along for the journey? Because a lot of it's just the education. They're not used to seeing satellites move around space a lot. They're used to them launching and end up in one orbit, and they pretty much stay there. And so what are the rules of the road, right? How do you think about space traffic management? How do you think about who notifies whom when you make certain maneuvers? The government can only go so far in actually making those decisions. And if they were just to make those decisions in a vacuum, it's almost certainly going to be a failure. And so I think they recognize that. And I think industries really recognize that as well. And so there's been a lot of good conversations. There's entire conference days that are dedicated to thinking about these issues of how do you create structure around the space environment without hindering innovation and growth, but making sure that people are staying safe and really building a sustainable future so that we don't make the same mistakes we've made on Earth about some of the ways that we go about protecting a pretty fragile environment. So you think about space debris and the challenges there. How do you tackle this, both dealing with space debris that's already there, but how do you get everyone on board to make sure that we're keeping it safe so that we don't have a massive increase in that over time that makes space unusable for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And Jerry, how do you, because now that you touched upon the space debris and the coordination with other satellite operators, that means that you have to coordinate with international companies. Can you, to the extent again you can you talk a bit about where is the international legal landscape today for space, and how do you see that evolving?
Yeah, so I guess I would caveat all this by, or qualify it by saying that there are space lawyers, and then there are lawyers who practice in the space industry, and I think I fall more in the latter category. There are a series of sort of international accords and treaties and things that in theory govern or guide international cooperation and how things are done in space, like the Outer Space Treaties or the Artemis Accords for the moon. I spend probably 0% of my time day to day kind of thinking about those things or applying those frameworks. And there's a lot of really talented folks in the industry who are, that is their job, and that's the way that they are trying to move the space industry forward. And so they are the ones who are really thinking through the policy side of how do we cooperate internationally, what are the incentives, disincentives. But there's the UN has several committees that deal with the peaceful use of outer space. And there's lots of kind of consortiums across international borders that try to work together. I'd say, generally speaking, a lot of the sort of US and their allies tend to have pretty good relationships internationally in terms of alignment about a lot of activities that occur in space. NASA works closely with ESA, works with JAXA, and so and the UK Space Agency. But there are certain actors in international situations that don't necessarily sort of subscribe to the same norms or don't feel like they need to be held accountable in the same way. And so there's going to be real challenges, and there currently are, about you can say we want to say that you need to deorbit after a certain number of years, or you need to think about debris in a certain way. And Russia or China might say, I'm just not going to do that. And there's really not that many mechanisms in place to be able to police that in a way that actually incentivizes them to align with other players in the space industry. So that's going to be a real challenge. There's a lot of smart people thinking about it, but yeah, is it the carrot? Is it the stick? How do you really find the right pressure points to make sure that people are thinking about this as kind of a cohesive unit, because it is truly international, and you have to separate the political side from the scientific side, and there's just a lot of different ways people work together. And so I'd say that's going to be one of the biggest challenges moving forward is how do you maintain that ability to make decisions in a way that everyone can be on board with and subscribe to without hindering their own internal interests and what they want to do in space.
Thanks, Jerry. We have 15 more minutes, and I see that Josh has put a message. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, and you can speak, or you can type your question in the chat. If not, I'll continue with the conversation with Jerry. And Jerry, coming back to your career and your venturing into space, you hustled your way through, and you said that you reached out to a number of startups, and you took an internship first, and then got a full-time role. Can you talk a bit more about that time when you made this move, and what are some of the guidance or advice you have for students who are graduating now?
Yeah, so like I said, when I got to UChicago, I really wanted to reflect on what is it that I'm passionate about, where's sort of the overlap of what I'm good at, what I'm interested in, what gets me excited. And it seemed like working in a startup environment was definitely ticking a lot of those boxes. I like the idea of working closely with a small group of people to think creatively and build something. I wasn't necessarily ready to jump in the deep end of becoming like a sole founder, or necessarily had this like burning idea that I was like, I need to to bring this out in the world, but I really just wanted to be surrounded by that environment where it felt like I could contribute in a meaningful way. And being at UChicago for business school was a great environment where you have literally hundreds of students in your class who are all thinking about those ideas. Some of them have ideas already. Some of them are also in that similar boat of, I just want to find a group of people and figure out what to do. So, I took as many of the entrepreneurial class offerings that Booth had, tried to stay active in the clubs and just start meeting people. And, at the time I was thinking, well, do I want to be an operator? Do I want to try to find my way into venture capital? I did an internship in VC, recognized there are two schools there. There's a school that says you can jump right in. There's a lot of folks that say you have to be a startup operator before you can be an effective venture capital investor. But ultimately, I thought that joining an early stage startup is really going to be where I could get my start in that, at least. And like I said, space has always been really fascinating to me. All my science fair projects were space related, but without the technical degree, I really hadn't been tracking the growth of commercial activity in space in the 2010s, especially. And so in my head, I kind of thought, well, I'm not going to go to NASA. I don't really know if there's this need for someone who has, whether it's legal expertise or business acumen, to really find the right spot there. But as I started just being more deliberate about that search process, realizing just there are already hundreds of space startups. And then, it was just it was kind of finding the people who I thought might be friendly, or just really leveraging the .edu school address, and really just being curious and saying, I'm a student, I'm trying to figure out what to do next. And some people wanted to talk to me, some didn't. But Megan Crawford, so she's a space only venture capital investor. She has a fund called Space Fund in Texas. She has an MBA, and she had been doing a lot of work at an MBA as one of the business schools in Texas with a kind of startup competition for space companies. And so she had been really in that world. And so I cold emailed her and said, hey, let's chat. And then she had made a pre-seed investment in Orbit Fab. And so I got an introduction to them through her. So it was just a lot of kind of persistence and curiosity, and space is full of space nerds, which is great, but you have to kind of want that, right? You have to want to be able to dive into the technical aspects. Even the business development folks in the space industry, they have to have a pretty solid working knowledge of their tech, of the trends in space industry from a pretty technical standpoint. And so as someone who, even though I don't have the technical degree, has always loved math and science, it felt like the right fit. But I'm really grateful that a lot of my colleagues on the engineering side are really willing to engage with what I consider to be stupid questions, but they won't admit it. They say, there's no stupid questions. And I'm thinking, no, this is definitely a stupid question. But just that willingness to learn and be curious about the technical side has been, I think, an important component of that, because a lot of these startup founders are engineers or have that technical background, and they want to make sure that everyone can at least speak the language a little bit.
John, you have your hand raised. Please feel free to ask a question.
Oh, yes. Thanks very much. And thanks for so many great questions. I don't know that my question will be quite as good as the ones you've been asking thus far, but I'll do my best. So my background is in, I work for a defense contractor called SAIC, and I lead a lot of complicated RFP responses, with the federal government. And I guess I just want to know a little bit more about your experience with DIU. One of the big problems is, because large contractors have a lot of the qualifications and past performance and other such things to be able to win a lot of government business, it could be difficult for startups to be able to enter and to compete properly. So I wonder if your experience with DIU was mostly positive and gives you sort of an optimism about being able to get, because the country definitely needs more and different and better voices and technical skills. So I hope you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think overall the experience at DIU has been refreshing and easy. I thought the contract negotiations were surprisingly smooth, and one of the mechanisms that they're using more, and other entities like them are sort of the other transaction OTAs, or if you're building hardware, OTPs for prototypes, and
Yep.
and those attempt to effectively remove themselves a little bit from the traditional federal acquisition regulations, FAR or DFARS for the DoD, aspects of contracting that can be the really onerous pieces, and allows, it almost feels like a commercial contract in a lot of ways. There's a little bit more give and take. There's certainly things the government can and cannot agree to, just by the nature of contract. There is a lot more flexibility there. And for us, we started through the SBIR program. So for people who don't know, that's the Small Business Innovation Research, and it's effectively small R&D research grants that allow companies to develop their technology with federal funding that is still really favorable to the contractor, to allow them to maintain ownership over the IP that's created, and gives the government pretty limited license in that tech for 20 years. So it really gives the incentive for startups to really take the money, build out technologies that are dual use. So both they have commercial, they want companies to build commercially viable technology. That's a kind of a critical component of that also might have interest from the government customers. And so really throughout that process, I'd say what helped make DIU a little bit, that process easier, was through the SBIR process, just making the right relationships and maintaining them with the government customers in a meaningful way. And those are genuine connections. You can't be lip service, but I think for us, the ability to listen to what it is the end user or customer actually is looking for out of a program, as opposed to, I think some companies in the SBI world, they think they have a technology they like, and they don't really care that there's a customer for it. There's, I have this cool widget. And the government might throw some money at them, but at the end of the day, it's not really, it's just like any other startup product, or you have to have that product market fit. And that market just is the government, and they have different incentives and desires, and they can be a little bit more opaque. And it's finding the right champions within there, where really any program or proposal that we respond to, we now have a pretty good stable of MOUs or letters of support from people who have pretty big sway in the government, because they've seen, sort of when you talk about past performance, it's not the traditional past performance that a competitive bid might have, but they know that they can trust that we'll be able to sort of meet them where they need to be and grow with them. And so I think, having that ability to understand what the contracting world looks like and finding the right people, and it's hard. You almost, it's really helpful to have, like, we've had people on our business development team who have worked on the procurement side for the government, in some capacity, working with startups through the Space Works program, for example.
Smart. Yep.
Yeah, and so they know, if you're in a room full of colonels that don't really have any decision-making authority, they'll listen, they'll be enthusiastic, but at the end of the day, you're not really necessarily moving the needle towards success. And so I think, the relationship building is just a really helpful component that helped the DIU process feel pretty smooth.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Sean, for the question. And Jerry, you mentioned the last few questions you mentioned, and then we'll pass it on to Josh, but you mentioned about the courses. Any recommendations on great courses at Chicago booth which you took, and any book recommendations? And the last question after that is, how has been your experience as a UChicago board member, and any reflections on that?
Yeah, so in UChicago, I came in thinking I wanted to build out the areas that I had less experience in. So to me, finance was a big one, and being at UChicago, it would be a shame not to at least take advantage of some of that. So the entrepreneurial finance and private equity class with Professor Kaplan, obviously a well-known class within the business school, but it just helped me learn a lot of the language. In my past work in M&A and working with startups, I had sort of been exposed to a lot of the business components of those deals, but when you're the M&A counsel, you don't necessarily have to dig into those at the same level or be able to speak as fluently. But I feel like I have a lot more confidence because of some of those courses, just to be able to recognize, when I can actually help on the business side as well. And to me, the best in-house counsel are those that have both the legal expertise and the business acumen. And if you're not able to sit in the room and kind of talk business strategy, I think you're missing opportunities there. And so Booth gave me that that confidence to feel like I can supplement a lot of what I've already learned and been exposed to, but really contextualize it nicely. I took entrepreneurial selling, which someone who's not particularly, I don't have the salesman mentality. I get a little anxious in those settings. Was great to step out of my comfort zone of thinking about how important sales is, and really thinking about it from a way of coming at it with genuine curiosity and authenticity, and really framing it in a way that didn't feel like it was the kind of slimy way that it could be portrayed sometimes. And I think that really was a good reset for me to think like how critical it is for startup founders, startup teams, even lawyers to try to think about how do you connect in an authentic way, in a way that makes sure that you're actually providing what you're providing is what they're trying to buy, and vice versa. So, but overall, and then MVC being part of a new venture challenge, just being a team of students trying to figure out how do you navigate this world, and just be able to get exposed to some amazing judges and mentors, and how do you craft a narrative around pitch decks. All those things I think are really helping me day to day in my legal practice, because I view my legal role as not just sort of the hired internal gun, but I really want to be someone who can contribute on the business side as well. So I'd say those are the key pieces there. And then of course, the board's been awesome. It was a really good reminder that space is truly interdisciplinary. The makeup of the board and makeup of the network, it's full of folks from just across that span the entirety of what space can look like, whether it's the business side or the technical side or the pure science side of things, or thinking about financing. And so that's been really great to be exposed to all of those and see that the passion for space is what ties all those things together. And that just UChicago has some pretty great people has been also a great reminder of that.
Thanks a lot, Jerry, and really appreciate you taking time and sharing your experience and guidance for the community. Over to you, Josh, to close out and also talk about the May event.
Well, let's throw up an applause emoji for our moderator, Gaurav Kumar, Senior Business Development and Integration Manager at BP, and our featured speaker, Jerry McIntyre, VP of Legal at Orbit Fab. I want to thank the alumni engagement team at UChicago for being a partner in helping build these multidisciplinary communities that Jerry, highlighted. I want to thank all of you for tuning into this hour of lunchtime learning, and I want to encourage you to please stay connected with us. I dropped a link in the chat to the UChicago Space Network group on LinkedIn, and also a link to subscribe to our UChicago Space Network newsletter. And then finally, during Alumni Weekend, you are invited to join the UChicago Space Network and the Physical Sciences Division at Adler Planetarium for a soiree featuring a sky show, introductory remarks from UChicago Space Network President Dave Fisher, and a faculty panel featuring UChicago cosmologist Rocky Cobb and Shiwei Chang. You can find details at the link below and RSVP. So hope to see you again soon, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.